And joining us again from London is Ben Southwood, who is head of research at the Adam Smith Institute. He argues that raising the living wage could have an impact on unemployment. Well, the OBR seems to agree with you to some extent, Ben Southwood, but not a lot, as Donald Hirsch was just saying.
Well, I don't know whether we can characterise it as not a lot. I think 60,000 jobs, which is how many the OBR says we'll have less than we would have had otherwise had we not put this policy into place, is quite significant. And I think that what's very important to remember is that these jobs are probably the most vulnerable people with the lowest skills and who we need to help most. I think in general, what we should care about is people's take-home pay, as Donald was saying. People's final income, as Donald was saying. We shouldn't necessarily care about how much of that income comes through wages. Now, I think George Osborne had an opportunity to give people a living wage in wages, in their take-home pay, in their final incomes, without necessarily doing it through a minimum wage. And he could have done that through raising national insurance contributions threshold up to the minimum wage, up to the income tax threshold. What he's done recently, which is very good, is lowered the taxes on low-paid workers through raising the income tax threshold. But he hasn't brought the national incomes contribution threshold up with that, which means that we could have given people a living wage without risking any jobs. Right.
Now, of course, the other side, which we've already mentioned of this, is that he's also cut tax credits. And one point that the Institute of Fiscal Studies makes is you don't need to be a brilliant economist to work out that poorer people are going to be worse off, because the money that's going to cost employers to implement the minimum wage is less than the money that's going to be saved by the cuts in tax credits. But the crucial thing is, can realistically over the next period, the cuts in tax credits be overcome by increases in wages?
Well, it's possible. The one thing we really don't know about and need to think about is productivity. So if we can get productivity to rebound, and if we can solve the productivity puzzle, or if we suddenly find out that maybe we are more productive than we thought we were, then wages might start rising.
But presumably you would reject the point that Donald Hirsch just made, that the increased minimum wage can itself be a driver of increased productivity.
Well, it's at least possible, but I don't think it's very likely. And that's because if firms could get more out of workers by paying them more, they would do it. There are thousands and thousands of competitive firms, and they're all looking to get as much as possible out of their workers. Now, what reason do we have to think that firms aren't working their workers as hard as they can and trying to make them as efficient as they can? I don't really think there's any reason to believe that we will magically be able to make workers more productive just by paying them more.
All right. Now, can I just quote you? Ian Duncan Smith in today's Telegraph, he says, "I'm not saying people won't be worse off. That is true, and it's not easy to do. But as long as we're striving to create more jobs and keep the economy growing, then people can make decisions to find work, and this is the critical path out of poverty." Now, I see the point he's making, because his argument is that people like the IFS just look at things in a very static way. They don't consider that, well, incomes don't need to be static. People can get better jobs, or they can increase their earnings. But I'm interested in your take on the tax credit cuts, because one argument is they actually make that cliff where if you earn more money, you lose all your benefits. They make that situation worse in a way that completely contradicts what Ian Duncan Smith says.
So yes, I agree with you that it's very important to be dynamic rather than static, but I also agree with you that the cliff is being made worse, firstly, and secondly, in general, this is just the wrong way to be going with welfare and our policy for the low paid. Our policy should not be trying to magic up wage increases. Our policy should be recognising some people are at that point in their life lower skilled and can't produce as much and therefore can't earn as high wages, and then trying to top them up so they can have a decent standard of living anyway. I think tax credits were an excellent way of doing that, such as policy goes. And I think that moving towards a higher minimum wage... But
I'm interested you say that. So you think that the disincentives to work will get greater? Because, of course, I mean, you're sounding like Gordon Brown. His point was that the taper had to be very slow to minimise the amount you would lose by taking a job.
Well, look, we always have to balance out. The sharper the taper, the less we spend on benefits and the more we can target them to the worse off. But it also means the higher disincentives to going back into work. And this is just a hard problem. It's really hard to say which side of this we should be on. But I do think that we're going too much in the one direction. I've heard estimates that the effective marginal tax rates, so the withdrawal rates, are something like 80%. Now, we often say, well, if the rich were being taxed at 80%, they're not going to do extra work, they're not going to produce all that wealth that makes us all better off. Well, we could say that exactly the same for people on the lower end of the spectrum. If they're being taxed at 80%, then why work?
All right, look, Ben Southwood, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, I'm joined from our studio in Inverness by Professor